everyone, and welcome to Concept to Culture. Today we have with us architect Spoorthi Satheesh, who will be taking us through a very interesting topic, which is called the Poetics of Place. I think this is a topic which is going to dwell into a lot of dialogues which I have not personally heard in the past. And I think it's very important we talk about how the atmosphere and emotion, both in the text and the built form, how are they influencing us as designers, as laymen and women on a daily basis. So I will begin with asking architect Spoorthi to tell us a little about herself and what got her here. Why are we today together to talk about something as unique as the Poetics of Place?
Wow, when you call me architect Spoorthi, it has been a while since I heard that term because I did graduate as an architect. I hold a master's in architecture, history and theory as well, but it has been a while since I practiced as an architect, and the reason being I now work in design communications, and I work for a PR and communications agency in Chicago that focuses primarily on the design industry. And I think it was the perfect find for me because it was a marriage of sorts of both my interests. Even though I didn't see myself practicing as an architect, I still wanted to be very intertwined in the design world itself. I love design, I love architecture, and then I found a passion for writing and people in general and wanting to champion the design world. And I feel like the design communications lets me do that. And I think we'll be dwelling more into that as well and how it becomes important in the design industry. So that's me, I guess.
Perfect. I think we'll start off with dwelling a little more into, like you said, right? It's a marriage of text, it's a marriage of architecture, a lot of writing. A lot of people, to be honest, don't even know that there is a scope for something like this, that there is design communication and it's a whole niche by itself. So how do you see the relationship between something like storytelling and spatial design? Do you really think a story can take form even before a built space comes alive?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm endlessly intrigued by people who live at the intersection of design and storytelling because I think it's the fundamental truth of the built environment. Not just the built environment, the natural world and everything. And there is a story behind everything that we do, and not everyone truly understands that. And that's where I think design communication comes into play. Storytelling and design are not separate entities. They shape each other from the very beginning. Before a space is even built, when a story can serve as a conceptual framework guiding the mood, materiality, and flow, one can imagine how they will feel in a particular space and how it will be used. And that, in turn, allows the space to be shaped. Say, whether a story is rooted in history, culture, community, or a person's personal narrative, it brings intention to every design decision. And I see storytelling as a way to humanize architecture in that sense and anchoring it in meaning rather than form, I would say. In a sense, a well-told story doesn't just inspire a space, but it becomes the space itself.
So I think you said something very powerful, right? About how it's the intention. You're setting intention. We're taught about this in architecture school from day one through your concepts, through the entire process. But I don't think there is enough dialogue around the writing part, right? And I think that is really the bridge between the designer and somebody who's on the user, basically. So if you can sort of tell us the importance of that, though you covered a large part of it, but today in this world where it could always be about visuals, it could be about the graphics, the importance of sort of saying that, no, I think the way we write it, the way we express this information as text is equally important, right?
Yeah. Let me give you an example so that everybody who's listening can understand where I'm coming from. Say, take a poem, for instance, or a child's storybook, and take, say, a season, maybe spring. So we're always, while reading a poem or while reading a storybook, we kind of form a perception of how spring should look like or how summer should look like, no matter where we are in the world and how we're experiencing spring or summer. And it the story or the poem creates an idea in our head of what a beautiful spring should look like. Similarly, I think it holds good for narratives about cities and the built environment itself. One can learn through the written word how to appreciate and perceive space, because not everybody is visual. Or I think humans innately are visual people, but then I think the written word helps them understand that they are visual people and helps them pause, take a look around them. But not to say, I don't want this to be misinterpreted as, oh, we're telling people how to feel, because I think it is cyclical. One, let me say this, like, it is cyclical because one always knows already how to feel. Like, there is a person feeling a certain way about spring, and then they write about it, and another person sees, and then they are more aware of how to feel during that season. And then I think the world inspires the story, and the story teaches us how to see the world. So it is a cyclical process. And I think the same applies to architecture and urban spaces. The built environment already tells stories in so many ways. People sometimes feel like they need to be into architecture or have a creative brain to understand and interpret those stories. But then when we take out the jargon and the exclusivity from it, the world becomes a place for all. And I think that's where design communications needs to be. I think it has gotten very good in the last couple of years in communicating to outside of the design world what design is and what you're seeing and experiencing. And I think it needs to continue to evolve, because even when in architecture school, if you do remember, there's a lot of things where when you talk about it to an outside person who is not in the field, they're like, I don't know and I don't understand what you mean. You guys have a lot of these terminologies. How can we dumb it? I don't even want to say dumb it down. How can we simplify it so that everybody can see the world around them? And because it exists, it's not like something we're not creating anything complex. We're just contributing to evolution around the world, and like design communication helps see it.
Oh, I think you put it so well, right? I think if I have to sort of paraphrase what you're in some sense trying to say, I think you're giving a very common experience to the common people, right? And when I say experience, it is to be able to visualize through these words. So I think the next thing that I really want to talk about is placemaking is something that's very atmosphere driven, context driven. It's a very emotional process. So how do you think literature and, let's say, design converge to evoke what we call as a sense of place? I'm going to enunciate a little more on that, just to sort of say that I know of a lot of designers, sometimes including me, even when I design a small product, it could be as simple as I'm reading an essay, I'm reading, some sort of a poem, and there's an inspiration that is picked up from that. And I say, oh, you know what? This can convert into a product. This can eventually convert into something more macro, like a place, right? So if you can talk to us a little about how these converge in some sense.
Yeah, I feel like it's less about writing in like the traditional literary sense, but more about constructing a narrative that anchors the work itself. Like, I feel like design is born at the intersection of multiple languages. It's visual, of course, as we all know it, verbal, emotional, and intellectual. So I feel the convergence of these languages are important, and they cannot be exclusive of each other. That's where narrative becomes a thread, and it connects the elements of like the design process. So it can not only guide research, it can like surface deeper intentions, as in, say somebody who is like reading a daily newspaper reads an article on design, and they're like, oh, this is a wonderful space, we've passed by it many times and we've not really understood it. Take the Bangalore airport, for instance. If somebody did go into the new terminal without any of the news articles that was surrounding it, sure, they would have felt beautiful. But then the power of social media and the power of journalism kind of like helped people understand the amount of innovation that has gone into that airport. As a result, again, it is not telling you how to look at a place, but it's only telling you about the nuances that has been in the place already. So when you're in that space, you're like, I read about this particular design detail. Look at it. It's so beautiful. So I think then it becomes more accessible. And going into your question about like the whole emotional aspect of it, I think for a long time, design has catered to the five senses: sight, sound, smell, and taste. However, there's a sixth layer to it: emotion and intuition. I feel not like design has not catered to it, but in the last few years, I've seen a shift where people are talking about multisensory design more. And they're like, I think it always existed, but I think people are becoming more aware that catering beyond the five senses is important. Creating to multiple senses is important, and as a result, they're more careful when asking to curate their own spaces. And when I say the sixth sense, it's not like a supernatural instinct or anything. Almost, I would say, layered awareness that kicks in, and that, I think, communication in any form, like say a news article, say social media, say a conference where a CEO of a design firm is speaking about their design intentions, it all brings that narrative and like embeds into a space of the future that has not already been built, because as humans we're constantly getting inspired.
And do you think architecture by itself has its own language, right? And how do we compare or contrast that with something like written language? Because in design, especially in practice, it's a very common thing to say architectural, in some sense, we're saying architectural language, focus on the language of architecture, right? So is there a contrast between the two?
I think yes and no to your question, because again, I think going back to exclusivity and jargon, I don't want to always call it jargon, because every field of work has its own language, and especially when there's a visual element, it has its own language. It's conveying without words, and that's what we want to do at the end of the day with our spaces, because we don't want people sitting and reading about every space and like realizing how to feel with it. It's more about the thread that we're creating, right? So I think it comes down to, yes, architecture has its own visual language, and every space and every little corner evokes that language as well. But when we're translating it into the written word, how are we simplifying it, and how are we conveying it in a way where people who are not in the field of design, or sometimes even outside of design enthusiasts, how are they perceiving it in a way where they're like, oh, interesting. There is so much to see in the world around us and in our own spaces that we go unnoticed. And a lot of other fields are successfully doing it. And I think it's time for the design industry to follow suit. Everybody in the world knows, like, Amazon is making tech innovations. Everybody in the world knows about AI. And because it's being communicated in a way where everybody understands it, where we become a little precious about design is, I think it kind of evokes a poet in us. And as a result, we talk about it so passionately, which should continue, but we do realize that sometimes as a result, we're not making it accessible to everyone around us. So yes, there is a layered complexity, but it doesn't have to be conveyed in a complex way.
This is very true. I think a lot of, in general, right, when people know you're an architect, there's a complexity sort of involved, right? Maybe the language we carry, the dialogues we're sort of having in some sense. I want you to sort of take us through what is your trajectory sort of been, right? As a practitioner, when I say practitioner, you're bringing designs to life through words, right? And there is a response from your clients, your stakeholders, or even the public in general. You're making it a lot more nuanced and a lot more easier. I'd break this into two parts. One is to ask you, how did you, someone as an individual, know, okay, you know what, this is what I want to do? Because it is a very niche aspect to really tap into the fact, like I've known you personally, and I know you've been a great writer. You've expressed very well, right, from the get-go. But when did you have that revelation to say, you are somewhere fighting, defying the odds in some sense, right? Because it's difficult to build in a niche like this, but to still say, no, I'm going to believe in this, do this. And I also do understand that there's a receiver, and that's who somewhere resonates with what you're voice sort of is trying to say, right? So, firstly, what's that trajectory? What led you to say, I'm going to use the poet in me to convey a little more? One thing. The other thing would be to sort of understand what is the response from, let's say, your clients or the stakeholders when they receive information in this written format in some sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to answer your first question, I think bear with me, it's a little bit of a layered story. It's first started off purely through interest. When I was in architecture school in Bangalore, whenever we used to have different sort of classes, studio, and then take design studio for instance, we had like different layers to it: site visits, literary analysis, research, and then finally we started designing. I always found myself more drawn to the research aspect of things, and then I don't know, there was a time where I think we were assigned a one pager article about the best. I think we let me rephrase that. We were assigned an article about writing about our design intention for a project. I forget what it was, but then it made me so happy to like actually convey it in the way I wanted to. And then I realized some of my friends hated doing that, and they were like, can you write this for me as well? Like, this is what I'm thinking. That's where I realized that I wanted to write, but then that is a very, very small aspect of it. I think the more I understood the design world, and then once I moved to the States, and then I started like delving into books and research and history of design, and everything came together and started making sense for me when I started reading it. And I also have started having these conversations. Predominant amount of my friends in grad school were not in the design industry, so they never understood what I do. They never understood what I work on. We've had like heated arguments where people say, oh, I think if the whole world were like just boxes, I don't think it would matter. And I think it's practicality over aesthetics. And people just think design is aesthetics. That's where a fire inside me was like, no, like, I need to be somewhere where I'm championing the design world. People are not understanding how good they're feeling in spaces. They're feeling it. Their moods are getting affected in a beautiful home, a beautiful resort they're in, or just a well-designed street. People are like, I love this city, or I feel very claustrophobic in the city. And where the disconnect is they're not understanding that all boils down to design. And so that's where I was like, I want to be in a field which champions the design industry. There are a lot of people who are designing and innovating, and I want to be able to be a storyteller of their work. So that took place in many aspects. Once I wrote my thesis, I started exploring what I can do. I really didn't know that there was a perfect fit. The term architecture journalism was very popular when we were studying, so I started like looking into options. And then my program director at that point of time was like, I know what you want to do, but why don't you just go work with the University of Cincinnati Press? They say they are doing a book for the School of Architecture, and why don't you go and see if you can like be in the publishing world? I was thinking about my career trajectory. I'm like, yes, this sounds like a very philosophical career line to have. Like, does this really exist? And at that point, there were very less people that I could go to who had done something similar and to act as like a role model or motivate me. But then again, I'm very thankful to like my thesis advisor and program director at the University of Cincinnati, who was like, gave me some ideas. They were like, I think it'll take you some time to like carve out your path and really realize what you're doing. And I do realize that at this point, I don't have a journalism background. I don't have like a communications background. So who's going to give me a job, right? And so that's where I think I really took on that advice of doing different electives in school, where outside of my mandatory design courses, I took like classes from the School of English and School of Journalism, and then also went on to work with the University of Cincinnati Press. I would almost say the stars aligned at that point, because they were publishing their first book for architecture. And on my program director's advice, I went and like knocking on their door, and I'm like, can you give me a job? And they were like, what would an architecture student have to do in the world of publishing? So I sat down with my boss at that point, and then I was like, see, this is where I want to go in life. And I know, like, working for a publishing press is not exactly you like being a journalist or you writing about design, but I want to at least be somewhat part of the literary world. And I know you're designing a book for the School of Architecture right now. Let me be a liaison between the School of Architecture and the press. And then if you like me, keep me. So they were like, okay, I guess we'll give you a chance. And then I didn't hear back from them for like a month or so. And then I was very disappointed. But then they got back to me and they were like, no, we had your passion in mind, but we didn't have the funds at that point and we really wanted to pay you something. So are you ready to do it for us for 10 hours a week? I'm like, I'll do it. And I loved it so much that, and I think I also found that sort of bond with them and kind of like went into the whole cycle pretty well. So they hired me as a publishing assistant at that point, full time, 20 hours. And I started working on other books and on urbanism, architecture, and many other things that might or might not even be related to design, and sort of somehow got my foot in the door into the literary world. And then COVID came in. And while it was COVID and the entire season of COVID was a nightmare, in terms of my career, I would say the whole concept of remote work was somewhat of a boon to me because I was able to juggle multiple internships at that point. So what I did was I wrote to multiple magazine editors and over LinkedIn, and one happened to actually get back to me. Her name was Aneta Novosielska, and she was the editor-in-chief of Hamptons magazine, which is by Modern Luxury. And she was like, can you write me a piece or two, and then we'll see if I can give you an internship. But like, mind you, this is an unpaid internship. I'm like, I'll do it. So I wrote 2 samples for her. She was like, okay, I think you have your summer internship. Do you want to still do it unpaid? I'm like, yes. And then I was still working for the press. I was writing multiple articles. And then initially she used to assign me design focused articles, which came out in the magazine. And then she said, to be a good writer, you need to be able to write about everything. So she started assigning me pieces about lifestyle, hospitality, and as I wrote about those different pieces, I did realize that design has sort of an intertwine with all these fields, and like design is not exclusive of these other fields that I spoke about. So I enjoyed writing about everything and did a couple more internships. I worked for a nonprofit called NYC by Design that now is owned by Sandow, the design media company, but it still works as a nonprofit to champion design in New York City. And they have an annual festival. So I worked as a marketing assistant there. And then finally, when I was like looking for my full-time jobs, I had all of these experiences under my belt, and I was able to convince Joe to take me as not only as a subject matter expertise at design, but then I was like, oh, I come with some experience in the design world, and it's just been, knock on wood, a match made in heaven since then.
Yeah, I think a marriage of so many different things which came together, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think one of your, like you said, your program chairs or whoever mentored you through thesis told you it's going to take you a while to really realize, what do I want to do with it? So I think it's a very powerful place to be because you are storytelling. You are somewhere setting the tone. Like you said, we all begin from a place of memory. We begin from a place of nostalgia. Even for a little child, when a story is told, it's so fascinating, like you mentioned, that you're setting the premises of this visualization that they can sort of envisage and sort of, break down and see what the possibility could be. But I think to sort of, if I have to ask you about storytelling, do you think, especially when we talk about design, it can make it more accessible, more inclusive? We have somewhere dwelled into this, but can it, in some sense, invite more, let's say, voices into the process, right?
Yeah, of course. So storytelling, I think, has the power to make space more inclusive by grounding design in human experience. When we read about something, we start living ourselves in those stories. It might be real stories, lived stories, diverse stories, and we begin to understand the emotional, cultural, and social context in which a place was set or will be set. So I think it moves us beyond designing for people and designing with them. So a good story also creates empathy. It asks, who are we designing for? Who are we designing with? What are the histories present here? And what are the voices we are missing in these spaces? And who has been overlooked? And sometimes it's not just about, when people think about inclusive, they're thinking about different genders, races, and ethnicities. It is that, and beyond all of that, also, it's people in different phases of life. To give you an example, take a woman who is going through motherhood in a workplace, and we've seen, especially in the architecture and design industry, as in the case of many other industries, women take a lot more time to get into leadership positions than men do. And motherhood is a huge thing that comes into picture then, because the expectations are very different from a mother, and she's not able, it's her life has changes now, and her life has different priorities. And I do see that the world we are in today is accommodating it in so many levels, but we still have a long way to go. And so I think when people start to think about inclusivity in different ways and just not giving it certain labels, and thinking of every person and even like temporary disabilities and everything, and how we can make, since we're taking the example of workplace here, how we can make a workplace and how we can design it in a way which includes everyone in different phases of life. And I think we create space that tells a different story. So where, to go back to my original point, storytelling has the power to do that. When you're writing about all of these things, and when you're voicing it out or communicating it in different ways, again, be it social media, be it print journalism, be it digital journalism, or be it your own content about blogs, newsletters, you're spreading the word to too many people, and then you're kind of urging them to think in different ways as designers. I think as designers and storytellers, it becomes almost a civic responsibility for us to talk about our design in a way that inspires the future generation to do not only what we're doing well, but to do better.
No, I think thank you for mentioning that. I think it
Yeah.
is a responsibility, right? More than anything, whether you're in practice, whether you're having a conversation with somebody, right? Even I feel that there is a huge responsibility in how you convey information, the words you choose, because you are at the realm of representation, especially for a user who's coming to you not knowing a lot about the field, and I think each of us have that responsibility, no matter where you are, no matter in what, even as simple as we having a dialogue in the form of a podcast, there's a responsibility of what you're going to sort of convey,
Yeah.
right? Which is so important. But I think I'm just curious to sort of ask you, you said something very interesting of, bringing various topics, making it inclusive. We're not talking just about races, genders, it's about various phases in life. This is something I speak to a lot of designers about because I think it's always been important, but I think this has gotten light in the longest time where empathy is such a forefront thing, right? Even as simple as, let's say, your client comes to you with a brief. How much of your baggage are you letting go at the door and saying, okay, you know what? I want to create a space that's sensitive, that is warm, that resonates, right? So even with writing, I'm sure there is a tonality where to resonate with somebody, more than to resonate, I think, do you think sometimes it's an intentional choice also to bring out that voice of compassion, that voice of empathy through your spaces? Because I think spaces are a very powerful way in which we sort of, emote sensations, we emote senses. Senses, again, is a very tangible thing, but there is an intangible aspect to it, right? So do
Absolutely.
you think it's important we sort of convey empathy, sensitivity, even in the way we write?
Absolutely. And I think I go back to my original point here, where I think the very intention of when you're writing about your work, you're writing about design, I think we should stop trying to make it as complex and as beautified as possible, and to try to simplify it as much as possible. And when you're simplifying it, there's already empathy in that because you want it to reach the larger crowd. And when you have that empathy and you're writing and you're putting yourself in the shoes of everyone around and not just the design industry, I think the tone automatically kicks in. And then of course there are parts to it too. You know, as a design communicator, you're understanding the work either as a designer yourself or not. You're either understanding the work that has been created and the stories and the background that has gone in, which the space, obviously the person who's living in it feels and experiences, but for somebody else who might be stepping into that space without that knowledge, it becomes good context. So I think when your initial intention of what you're going to convey and who your audiences are, I think that itself becomes a point of empathy, and everything else follows through after.
That's a whole new perspective to sort of look at it. It's not always that's actionable, doesn't have to be loud and made noise about, but it begins with the intention. So I think lastly, I'd sort of end this conversation. I definitely at some point wanted to ask you, there are so many options out there, right? We live in a world where things are evolving, growing. There's so much that's happening. But why is it that you as an individual sort of show up to do what you do? What is it that there is something deeper than what we are talking about a lot of things, but there's something deeper innately from a soul level that's really getting you to show up every day and say, okay, this is why I choose to do what I do. What is that?
I think that is such a nuanced question. I think there are a couple of different layers to it. Like I said, I think it comes from the fire of wanting to champion the design world. And when I say the design world, it's literally the world we live, breathe in every day. It's the spaces around us. It's the world that we humans have created in the world that has been given to us. And I want people to know the space that they're living in. And then, as a result, feel better in it and feel good in it if they're not already. So that's my intention. Wherever I am, in whichever part of the world and whatever I'm doing for a career, I think that will be my intention to, like, if I had the superpower to like call each person and be like, come, look at the space around you, see how beautiful you feel around it, I would do that. But then of course I can't do that. So I'm trying to find ways and means in which I can do that. And help. This might sound extremely philosophical, but by celebrating the beautiful world that we're creating around us, inspire people to do better as designers, but also inspire non-designers to look and feel happy in a space, feel safe in a space, look around them, and just help their mental health. I think it's just so layered, and that's what I want to do every day. So if that makes sense.
That's a very noble choice to make on a daily basis, right? And thank you for representing yourself, the fraternity in some sense, to do something for the bigger good, to sort of pay forward and say, okay, this is how I contribute. Because I'm sure it's not easy in your own domain to sort of carve something out, carve a niche, and to say, you know what, I am going to step offset from what is conventionally being set and say, okay, this is what I want to do. So thank you for being so authentic. I think this is why we have curated this to talk about the process of a concept to a cultural influence. And I think what you're doing on a daily basis is beginning to set narratives in that way. And thank you so much for coming on board and sharing this story with us. Design communication is, I think, something I've always been very, very interested in as well. And I'm sure there are a lot of students, a lot of new people in the industry who are very curious about this, but never knew how to tap into it. So I'm sure your story will inspire a lot more.
Thank you for giving me a platform to talk about everything that always runs in my head and also ramble a little bit. I also want to congratulate you on your podcast because you're doing exactly that. You're taking these voices and bringing it to people who might or might not know about its existences.